everyone. I'm Melissa here, and welcome to your Melissa Moment. Hello, everyone. Melissa here. Welcome to your Melissa Moment, and welcome to Turn the Page Thursday. This is the second day of our brand new series, Book Club, where we are currently reading the Stephen King book, You Like It Darker. If you missed last week, which was day one, I'll give you a little bit of a recap, okay? So this book is a series of short stories. The first story that we started reading doesn't have any chapters to it. It's just one long story. So I typically am reading about 30 minutes, okay? A recap of what I remember is a gentleman is talking about his father who has now passed away and his father's best friend. There is a reporter who is interested in writing a story about their life. Apparently, his father and father's best friend grew up very poor, and they both became very successful and rich people. So she's very intrigued. But it sounds like his father may have had a dark secret that we have no idea what it is yet. So let's continue on with our story today and see if we can figure out what it is. I'm just going to set a 30-minute timer, and when that goes off, I will finish whatever page we happen to be on, and we'll go from there. As you can tell, I also am cozy in my little chair here. I'm just going to adjust you a bit. Also, I'm just going to be reading from the book. So if you don't want to just sit there and watch me read, you can either read along with me if you have it, or you can just listen to me like a podcast and you can go on with your day. Or maybe you're driving on a long trip and you just want to listen to my soothing voice read you a story. That's okay too. So let's jump into it. Alexa, set a timer for 30 minutes.
30 minutes, starting now.
Perfect. I wasn't a child any longer, but I was alone. In 1988, I married Susan Wiggins, a lawyer in the county attorney's office. She said she wanted kids, but kept putting it off. Shortly before our 12th wedding anniversary, for which I'd purchased a string of pearls, she told me she was leaving me for another man. There's a lot more to the story. I suppose there always is, but that's all you need to know, because this story isn't about me. Not really. But when my father said that thing about not leaving me broke, what I thought of, what I believed we both thought of, is to whom I would leave that 10 million or whatever remained of it when my time came. Probably Main School Administrative District 19. Schools always need money. You must know, Ruth said to me that day in the coffee cup. You must. Off the record, remember? Off the record or on it, I really don't, I said. All I knew was something happened to Pop and Uncle Butch in November of 1978 on their annual hunting trip. After that, Pop became a best-selling writer of thick novels, the kind critics used to call three-deckers, and Dave LaVerdiere gained fame first as an illustrator and then as a painter who combines the surrealism of Frida Kahlo with the American romance of Norman Rockwell. Maybe they went down to the crossroads, she said. You know, like Robert Johnson was supposed to have done? Made a deal with the devil. I laughed, although I would be lying if I hadn't had the same idea cross my mind. mostly on stormy summer nights when the rolls of thunder kept me awake. If they did, the contract must have been for a lot more than 7 years. Pop's first book was published in 1980, the same year Uncle Butch's portrait of John Lennon was on the cover of Time. Almost 40 years for Leverdier, she mused, and your father's retired, but still going strong. Strong might be too strong a word for it, I said, thinking about the pissy sheets I'd changed just that morning before setting sail for the Rock. But he is still going. What about you? How much longer are you going to spend in our neck of the woods, ferreting out dirt on Carmody and Leverdier? That's kind of a shitty way of putting it. I'm sorry, bad joke. She had eaten her muffin. I told you they were good. And was mashing up the few remaining crumbs with a forefinger. Another day or two. I want to go back to the elder care place in Harlow and maybe talk to Leverdier's sis again, if she's willing. I'll come out of this with a very salable piece, but no way is it the piece I wanted. Maybe what you wanted is something that can't be found. Maybe creativity is supposed to remain a mystery. She wrinkled her nose and said, "Save your metaphysics to cool your porridge. Can I pick up the check?" No. Everyone in Harlow knows our house on Benson Street. Sometimes fans of Pop's books from away stop for a peek if they happen to be on vacation, although they tend to be disappointed by it. Just your typical New England salt box in a town that's full of them. A little bigger than most, set back from a good-sized lawn dotted with flower beds. My mother planted those and tended them until she died. Now Jimmy Griggs, our handyman, keeps them watered and pruned, except for the daylilies growing along the picket fence out front. That is, Pop likes to see them himself, because Mom loved them best. When Pop waters them or just walks their length, limping slowly along on his cane, I think he does it to remember the woman he always called my dear Sheila. Sometimes he bends to caress one of the blossoms, crowns that form on leafless stems called scapes. The blooms are yellow, pink, and orange, but he particularly likes the red ones, which he says reminds him of her cheeks when she blushed. His public persona was crusty and a bit cynical. Plus, there was that dry sense of humor. But at heart, he was always a romantic and could be a bit corny. He told me once that he kept the part hidden because it bruised easily. Ruth knew where the house was, of course. I'd seen her cruise past in her little Corolla several times, and once she stopped to snap pictures. I'm sure she also knew that Pop was most apt to walk our picket fence looking at the daylilies at mid-morning. And if you don't know by this point, she was a very determined lady. I haven't done my job. 2 days after our off-the-record talk in the coffee cup, she came slow rolling down Benson Street, and instead of driving past, she pulled over and stopped right next to the little signs on either side of the gate. One says, "Please respect our privacy." The other says, "Mr. Carmody does not give autographs." I was walking with Pop as I usually did when he inspected the daylilies. He turned 88 in the summer of 2021, and even with the cane, he sometimes tottered. Ruth got out and approached the fence, although she made no effort to try the gate. Persistent, but also mindful of boundaries. I liked her for that. Hell, I liked her, period. She was wearing a flower-printed mask. Pop wasn't. Claims they made it hard to breathe. But he'd had no objections to the vaccinations. Pop looked at her with curiosity, but also with a faint smile. She was good-looking, especially in the light of a summer morning. Checked shirt, denim skirt, white socks and sneakers, hair pulled back in a teenager's ponytail. As the sign says, miss, I don't give autographs. Oh, I don't think that's what she wants, I said. I was amused by her chutzpah. My name is Ruth Crawford, sir. I wrote and asked for an interview. You turned me down, but I thought I'd try one more time in person before getting on the road to Boston. Ah, Pop said. Me and Butch, right? And is serendipity still your angle? Yes, although I don't feel I ever really got to the heart of the matter. The heart of darkness, he said, and laughed. Literary joke. I've got a bunch of them, although they have been gathering dust since I retired from giving interviews. I vow I intend to keep, even though you seem like a nice woman, and Mark here tells me you're well about it. I was both surprised and pleased to see him extend a hand over the fence. She seemed surprised too, but she shook it, being careful not to squeeze too hard. Thank you, sir. I felt I had to try. Your flowers are beautiful, by the way. I love daylilies. Do you really? Or are you just saying that? I do, really. My wife did as well. And since you've been kind enough to compliment what my dear Sheila loved, I'm going to offer you a fairy tale deal. Her eyes were sparkling. Her good looks and maybe her chutzpah had perked him up the way a splash of water seemed to perk up his dear Sheila's blooms. She smiled. What would that be, Mr. Carmody? You get 3 questions, and you can put my answers in your article. How was that? I was delighted, and Ruth Crawford looked the same. Totally excellent, she said. Ask away, young lady. Give me a second. You're putting me under pressure. True, but pressure creates diamonds from coal. She didn't ask if she could record him, which I thought was smart. She tapped her lips with a forefinger, maintaining eye contact with Pops as she did it. Okay, question 1. What did you like best about Mr. Laverdier? He didn't stop to consider. Loyalty, trustworthiness. They come to the same, I suppose, or almost. Men are lucky to have even one good friend. Women, I suspect, have more, but you would know better than I. She considered. I think I have 2 friends I'd trust with my deepest secrets. No, 3. Then you're lucky. Next question. She hesitated because she probably had at least 100 of them, and this short interview over our picket fence, for which she hadn't prepared, was going to be her only shot. And Pop's smile, not entirely kind, said he knew the position he'd put her in. Time is ticking away, Miss Crawford. Soon I'll have to go inside and rest my tired old pins. All right. What's your best memory of time you spent with your friend? I'd like to know the worst time too, but I want to save my last question. Pop laughed. I'll give you that one for free because I like your persistence and because you're easy on the eyes. The worst time was out in Seattle. The last cross-country trip I imagine I'll ever make. Looking at a coffin and knowing my old friend was inside. His talented right hand stilled forever. And the best? Hunting in the 30 Mile, he said promptly. We went the second week of November from the time we were teenagers right up until Butch mounted his steel pony and set sail for the Golden West. We stayed at a little cabin in the woods that my grandfather built. Butch claimed that his grandfather pitched in when it came to the roofing, which might or might not have been true. It was a quarter mile or so beyond Gelassie Creek. We had an old Willie's Jeep, and until '54 or '55, we drove it across the plank bridge, parked on the other side, and humped it to the cabin with our packs and our rifles. Then we got so we didn't trust the Willies on the bridge because floods had undercut it some. So we'd park it on the town side and walk across. He sighed, looking off in the distance. What with all the clear cutting by Diamond Match and that housing development on Dark Score Lake where the Noonan place used to be. 30-Mile Wood is more like 20-Mile Wood now. But back then there was plenty of forest for 2 boys, then 2 young men to ramble around in. We sometimes shot a deer. Once we shot a turkey that turned out tough and sour, but the hunting was the least of it. We just liked being on our own for those 5 or 6 or 7 days. I guess a lot of men take to the woods so they can drink and smoke, maybe go out to the bars and bring back a night's worth of poontang. But we never did those things. Oh well. Yes, I mean, we drank a little. But if we brought a bottle of Jack, it'd last us the whole week, with some left over, which we pitched into the fire to watch the flames shoot up. We talked about God and Red Sox, politics, how the world might end in nuclear fire. I remember once we were sitting on a log, and a buck, biggest one I ever saw, an 18-pointer, maybe the biggest one anybody ever saw, at least in these parts. It came walking through the marsh below us, as delicate as you please. I raised my rifle, and Butch put his hand on my arm. "Don't," he said. "Please, don't. Not that one." So I didn't. Nights we'd lay a fire in the fireplace and have us a knock or 2 of Jack. Butch brought a pad and he'd draw. Sometimes, while he did, he'd ask me to tell him a story. And I did. One of those stories eventually became my first book, The Lightning Storm. I could see her trying to remember it all. It was like gold to her, and it was like gold to me. Pop never talked about the cabin. I don't suppose you've read an essay called Come Back to the Raff Agan Huck Honey, have you? Ruth shook her head. No? No, of course not. Nobody reads Leslie Fielder anymore. What a shame. He was outrageous, a slayer of sacred crows, and that made him fun. He argued in the essay that homoeroticism was the great engine of American literature, that stories of male bonding were actually stories of suppressed sexual desire. Bullshit, of course. Probably says more about Fielder than it does male sexuality. Because why? Can either of you tell me? Ruth looked like she was afraid to break the spell, the one he'd cast over himself as well as her. So I spoke up. It's shallow. Turns male friendship into a dirty joke. Oversimplified, but not wrong, Pop said. Butch and I were friends, not lovers. And during those weeks in the woods, we enjoyed that friendship in its purest state, which is a kind of love. It wasn't that I loved Sheila less, or that Butch didn't enjoy his trips up the city less. He was so crazy about rock and roll music, which he called bop. But in the 30-Mile, all the bump, bustle, and roar of the world fell away. You keep close, I said. We did indeed. Time for your last question, miss. She didn't hesitate. What happened? How was it that you stopped being men of the town and became men of the world, cultural icons? Something in his face changed, and I remembered my mother's distress call when I was in college. Your father looks like he saw a ghost. If so, I thought he was seeing it again. Then he smiled, and the ghost was gone. We were just two talented bastards, he said. Leave it at that. Now I need to get inside and out of this bright sun. But no, he spoke curtly, and she recoiled a little. We're done. I think you got more than you expected, I told her. Be content with that. I guess I'll have to. Thank you, Mr. Carmody. Pop lifted one arthritic hand in acknowledgement. I guided him back to the house and helped him up the porch steps. Ruth Crawford stood there for a bit, then got in her car and drove away. I never saw her again, but of course I read the article she wrote about Pop and Uncle Butch. It was lively and full of amusing anecdotes, if short on real insight. It was in Yankee magazine, and twice the length they usually allowed for their articles. I'm sure she really did get more than she expected when she stopped by the house on her way out of town, and that included the title, Two Talented Bastards. My mother, Sheila Wise Carmody, Our Lady of the Daylilies, died in 2016 at the age of 78. It came as a shock to everyone who knew her. She didn't smoke. She only drank the rare glass of wine on special occasions. She was neither or under or nor underweight. Her mother lived to 97, her grandmother to 99. But Mum suffered a massive heart attack while driving home from the Castle Rock IGA with a load of groceries in the trunk of her car. She pulled over on the shoulder of Siroas Hill, set the emergency brake, turned off the engine, folded her hands in her lap, and went into the darkness that surrounds this bright flash we call life. My father was shaken by the death of his old friend Dave Laverdier, but his wife's death left him inconsolable. She should have lived, he said at her funeral. Someone in the clerical department has made a terrible mistake. Not very eloquent, nor his best, but he was in shock. For 6 months, Pop slept downstairs on the pull-out couch. Finally, at my urging, we cleaned out the bedroom where they had spent over 21,000 nights. Most of her clothes went to the Goodwill in Lewiston, which was a favorite charity. He shared her jewelry out among her friends, with the exception of her engagement ring and her wedding ring, which he carried in the watch pocket of his jeans until the day he died. The cleaning out was a hard job for him, for both of us. But when it came to clearing her little study, hardly more than a closet adjacent to the mudroom, he flat refused. I can't, Mark, he said. I just can't. It would break me. You'll have to do it. Box up her papers, put them in the basement. I'll look at them eventually and decide what needs to be kept. But so far as I know, he never did. Those boxes are still where I put them, under the ping pong table that no one has used since Mum and I used to have spirited games down there. Mum swearing colorfully every time I hit a smash she couldn't handle. Cleaning out her little think room, as she called it, was hard. Looking at the dusty ping pong table with its sagging green net was even harder. A day or two after Pop's extraordinary picket fence interview with Ruth Crawford, I found myself remembering how I'd forfeited myself with a Valium before going into her think room, with a couple of empty banker boxes. When I got to the bottom drawer of her desk, I found a stack of spiral notebooks, and when I opened one, I'd seen my father's unmistakable back-slanted printing. They predated his breakthrough, after which every book, even the first, became a bestseller. His first three novels, written before word processors and computers became commonplace, were composed on an IBM Selectric, which he lugged home after each afternoon from the Harlow town office. He gave me those typed manuscripts to read, and I remembered them well. There were places where he'd scratched out words and added different ones between the lines, and he'd make a pen slash through a paragraph or two if they went long. That's how it was done before the delete button was invented. Sometimes he used the X key, where a beautiful, lovely day might become a XXXXXXXXX lovely day. I'm going on about this because there were few strikeouts or strikeovers in the finished manuscripts of The Lightning Storm, The Terrible Generation, and Highway 19. The spiral notebooks, on the other hand, were full of crossouts, some so heavy they had torn the pages. Other pages had been entirely scribbled over as if in a fury. There were marginal notes like, "What happens to Tommy?" and "Remember the Bureau." There were a dozen of these notebooks in all, and the one at the bottom was pretty clearly a trial run at The Lightning Storm. It wasn't terrible, but it wasn't very good either. Thinking of Ruth's final question, also of my mother's distress call in 1978, I found the banker's box containing those old notebooks. I dug out the one I wanted and read some of it sitting cross-legged beneath a naked light bulb. A storm was coming! Jack stood on the porch, watching black clouds form in the west. Thunder rolled, lightning hit everywhere. Scratch that. Smashed the ground like battering rams of fire. The wind began to blow. Scratch that. Howl. Jack was wicked scared, but he couldn't stop looking. Fire before rain, he thought. Fire before rain! There was a picture in those words, and there was narration, but it was hackneyed the best. On the page and the ones that followed, I could see Pop straining to say what he saw, as if he knew what he was doing wasn't very good and kept trying to make it better. It was painful because it wanted to be good and wasn't. I went downstairs and got a copy of The Lightning Storm from the shelf of proofs in Pop's office. I turned to the first page and read this. A storm was on the way. Jack Elwood stood on the porch, hands in his pockets, watching as black clouds rose in the west like smoke, blotting out the stars as they came. Thunder muttered. Lightning lit the clouds, making them look like brains, or so he thought. The wind began to pick up. Fire before rain, the boy thought. Fire before rain. The idea terrified him, but he couldn't stop looking. Comparing the bad, but trying to be good, handwritten copy to the version in the finished book, I found myself thinking first of Butch Laverdier's dump murals, then of his painting of Elvis and Marilyn on the Midway, which had sold for $3 million. I thought again that one was the bud and one was the bloom. All over this country, all over the world, men and women are painting pictures, writing stories, playing instruments. Some of these wannabes go to seminars and workshops and art classes. Some hire teachers. The fruit of their labors is dutifully admired by friends and relatives who say things like, "Wow, really good," and then forget it. I always enjoyed my father's stories when I was a kid. They enthralled me, and I thought, "Wow, really good, Pop." As I'm sure people passing on Dump Road saw Uncle Butch's brash and busy murals of town life and thought, "Wow, really good," and then went on their way. Because someone is always painting pictures. Someone is always telling stories. Someone is always playing Call Me the Breeze on the guitar. Most are forgettable, some are competent, a very few are indelible. Why that should be, I don't know. And how those two countrymen made the leap from good to good enough to great, I didn't know that either. But I found out. 2 years after his brief interview with Ruth Crawford, Pop was once more inspecting the daylilies growing along the picket fence. He was showing me how outliers had begun to pop up on the other side of the fence, even on the other side of Benson Street, when I heard a muffled crack. I thought he might have stepped on a fallen branch. He looked at me with wide eyes. His mouth opened, and I thought, I remember this clearly. This is what Pop looked like when he was a kid. Then he tilted to the side. He grabbed for the fence. I grabbed his arm. We both missed our holds. He fell to the grass and began screaming. I didn't always carry my cell. I'm not of the generation that would not go more without a phone than without underwear. But that day I had it. I called 911 and told them I needed an ambulance at 29 Benson because my father had had an accident. I knelt next to Pop and tried to straighten his leg. He shrieked and said, "No, no, no, it hurts! Marky, it hurts!" His face was as white as fresh snow, as Moby Dick's underbelly, as amnesia. I didn't often feel old, probably because the man I lived with was so much older, but I felt plenty old then. I told myself not to pass out. I told myself not to have a heart attack, and I hoped the Harlow EMT wagon, which my father and Butch had paid for, was in the area, because an ambulance from Gates Falls would take half an hour, and one from the Rock might take even longer. I can still hear my father's screams. Just before the Harlow EMT vehicle showed up, he passed out. That was a relief. Alexa, cancel. They got him in the back with a powerful lift and took him to St. Stephen's, where he was stabilized. Supposing a 90-year-old man can be stabilized, and took x-rays. His left hip had snapped. There was no attributable cause. It just happened. Nor was it a mere break. The orthopedist told me it had exploded. "I'm not sure how to proceed," Dr. Patel said. "If he was your age, I would of course recommend hip replacement. But Mr. Carmody is suffering from advanced osteoporosis. His bones are like glass. All of them. And he is, of course, of an advanced age." He spread his hands above the x-rays. "You must advise me. Is he awake?" Patel made a call. That's a package. Hang on 1 second. I'm wondering if they're going to leave it or if they have to get it. I'll be back. Got it. Is he awake? Patel made a call. Asked, listened, hung up. He's soupy from the pain medication, but conscious and able to respond to questions. He wants to speak to you. Even with COVID on the decline, space was at a premium in St. Stevie's. Still, my father was given a single room. This was because he could pay, but also because he was a celebrity. and loved in Castle Country. I once gave him a t-shirt that said, "Rock Star Writer," and he wore it. He was no longer as white as Moby Dick's belly, but he looked shrunken. His face was haggard and shiny with sweat. His hair was every which way. "Broke my goddamn hip, Marky." His voice was little more than a whisper. Oh, let's try that again. "Broke my goddamn hip, Marky." His voice was little more than a whisper. "That Pakistani doc says it's a wonder it didn't happen when we went to Butchie's funeral. Remember that?" Of course I do. I sat down beside him and took my comb out of my pockets. He held up a hand in his old imperious stop gesture. "Don't do that. I'm not a baby." "I know, but you look like a crazy person." The hand dropped to the sheet. "All right, but only because I once changed your shitty diapers." I guessed that had probably been Mom's job, but I didn't argue, just put his hair as right as I could. "Pop, the doc is trying to decide if you should have a hip replacement." "Hush up," he said. "My pants are in the closet." "Dad, you're not going anywhere." He rolled his eyes. "Jesus Christ, I know that. Bring me my key ring." I found it in his left front pocket beneath a little jingle of change. He held it close to his eyes with a trembling hand. I hated to see that tremble, and picked through the keys until he found a small silver one. "This one's the bottom drawer of my desk. If I don't pull through this clusterfuck, Pop, you'll be fine." He held up the hand with the keys in it, his old gesture. "If I don't pull through, you'll find the explanation for my success and Butch's in that drawer." Everything that woman, I can't recall her name just now, was curious about. She wouldn't have believed it, and you won't, but it's the truth. Call it my last epistle to the world. Fine, I understand. Now, what about the operation? Well, let's see. Let's think this through. If I don't have it, what? A wheelchair and a nurse, I suppose. Not a pretty one, a big, hairy, full back of a fellow with a shaved head who wears English leather. You certainly won't be capable of horsing my freight around, not at your age. I suppose that was true. I think I'm going to go for it. I may die on that operating table. I may pull through, do 6 weeks of physical therapy, and then break the other hip, or my arm, or my shoulder. God has a vile sense of humor. His bones were fragile, but his brains were still in good working order, even doped to the gills. I was glad he hadn't put the responsibility for the decision and its consequences on me. Well, friends, that's where we're going to end for today. Oh my goodness. So we know it's coming. That key will give us all the answers to their success. What do you think? What could it be? Did he make a deal with the devil? Did he come across a gypsy that he traded something for success? What else could it have been? I guess we'll have to wait until maybe next week. Thank you guys so much for joining me on our Turn the Page Thursday, where we are reading our current book, Stephen King, You Like It Darker. Until next week, friends. Bye.